Is there a purpose for temptations and trials? Let's dive right in. The book of James is one of my favorite New Testament books because it, again, comes from the lips of the earthly half-brother of Jesus.
Yeah.
And he's talking about experiences, I think, that he had with Jesus while he was growing up. So everything I see here, I always imagined that James was probably reflecting on what he saw in Jesus while he was living at home as his earthly brother.
Yeah.
And so it translates into the page. So to me, every direction that he gives us about do it this way, do it that way, I see Jesus in those answers.
Well, what's interesting is the book of James, the last time I checked, he only refers to Jesus directly twice.
Mm-hmm.
However, the amount of times he quotes Jesus or paraphrases him is much, much higher. And I love to call the book of James as the Proverbs of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. It's one of the books I always, especially for young Christians, always tell them to, you need to read it. It's very straight to the point. You don't have to be a theologian to get a lot of it, or, it's very straightforward, very simple.
It is, and it's in the classic passages. There's that great second chapter which talks about faith and what it really is. But the first chapter, which is what I want to zero in on today, deals with trials and temptations. And both words are used in the context of these opening verses. In particular, he says, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials in verse 2. And then he'll say later on that there are temptations that come, like in verse 13, let no man say when he's being tempted. Interestingly enough, the word for temptation and trial is the same word in the Greek. It's just the context determines which one the writer selects to use, or the translator selected to use. But I've always, when I read James 1, I come back to this. Every one of us face trials and temptations. It's a guarantee. You can't escape it if you're going to live on earth. Trials are external. So a trial is something that hits me from the outside. It's the environment in which I live.
Yeah.
And we'll see that in just a minute. And temptations are internal. They're the encounters, if you would, with a devilish idea or an evil desire, but they're from the inside.
Yeah.
And so we're tempted when we're enticed and carried away by our own lust, he will say down in verse 13. So we have both of those at play here, two things on the table. I think that this carries us back to the question, why in the world do we even have trials and temptations? Now, the short answer is, well, because we were created as creatures of free will. God wants to see what choice we'll make. But I think we need to see this as this ecosystem that we are living in. And this ecosystem is here for a purpose.
Yeah.
And even the fact that Satan is in this world, there is a purpose in all of that. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're 100% correct. And I know the obvious answer to your question is you could say to produce endurance, right? But endurance is part of the building of character.
That's verse 3.
And so you're right. The whole system of this world is designed to build us up, but into what? To be more like Christ. And so if you look at Christ, did Christ go through trials? Oh yeah. Just read Hebrews, 12, for for the joy, and then it goes, he endured.
Yes.
So why?
And in chapter 4, verse 15, he says, tempted every way we were.
Right, exactly. At every point. And to me, what is that saying is that if our mission here in life is to endure hardships, to be refined into the image of Christ, God uses those trials to shape us and mold us and to get us to where we need to be.
So the ecosystem that we live in, this is the perfect environment for us to prove whether God is in us or whether God isn't in us. Here we are created as creatures of free choice. Go back to Genesis 1, Adam and Eve. And now God has said, you're going to be dwelling in essence with a cellmate. And I've always said, even though I catch some flack over this, earth is a lot more like hell than it is heaven. Because we have Satan here. Satan will not be in heaven.
Yeah.
So looking into the future, this is a lot more like hell than it is heaven. There is a presence of evil that it will not be in heavenly realm so far as I can read in my Bible. And God can't look upon it. So we'll be in his presence. So that means it will not be there. So it almost makes me wonder initially why God cast Satan down to the earth after the rebellion. And again, why didn't he just throw him all the way into hell already? And again, it's like this is a stopping place for Satan, not so that he can prove himself, but rather it's a stopping place so that God's going to pull out of Satan everything that serves his purpose before Satan is cast into hell. Do you think biblically that'll hold up?
Yeah, no. Well, if you look even at the gospel, Satan was used to magnify the Son. In fact, the famous scene at the table, he basically turns, himself, Judas, over to Satan and allows himself to be arrested and all these things. So God constantly will use Satan to fulfill and accomplish his purpose here on the world.
And it's got to be so frustrating to him. There are two passages in the New Testament, Romans 8:17 and Ephesians 2:6, that says we as Christians will sit on the throne with Christ in the judgment or after the judgment, which, by the way, blows my mind. I can't even fathom that. I just want to be the guy that cleans up after the parade. I'm happy to be that in eternity. But he says we'll sit on the throne with him. If you go back and look at the passages that speak in kind of poetic, prophetic, kind of smoky language about what appears to be the origin of Satan or and his fall, you realize that even from what Jesus said, he's the father of deceit, and he was a deceiver, a liar from the beginning. You look at all that and you realize that what Satan really wanted was to be God. He wanted to sit on God's throne, and he'll never be able to. And I think the reason Satan hates us so much, and that the reason these trials and temptations now are here in such severe ways, he's very jealous of us. I mean, we get what he wanted, and he'll never possess it.
And ironically, humanity was last created. And Jesus says the last shall be first, and the first shall be last.
And the weakest, aren't we?
And I can't help but wonder if that has something to do with even the divine and the spiritual realms of order. But, I think when you look at the Gospels and you look at Satan, and I think it's 2 Peter 1 where it talks about even the angels were longing to see where God was going with all this. I don't think Satan would have put Jesus on the cross and killed him if he had known that was going to give salvation to the world.
Well, you're quoting 2 Corinthians now. If they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, referring to the Jews.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think if Satan really, in fact, I'm not so sure, he might not have wished that he could have pulled the reins back once he realized, oh no, this is not what I intended. This is the salvation of the world.
Yeah. And to me, that lets you know, I was like, well, if he had known, he probably would not have participated in his actions, but yet, over and over again, that should give you confidence in God. He knows how to use evil to bring about his good purpose.
And isn't that comforting? Because I think of, again, the world we're in. Satan here is our adversary. 1 Peter 5:8 says he prowls about as a roaring lion trying to devour us.
Yeah.
But in all of that, there is God's protection. Romans 8, he causes all things to work together for good. Verse 28 says, so we have this confidence. 1 Corinthians 10:13 speaks of how we aren't tempted beyond what we are able, but God always provides a way of escape. There's another protection and safeguard, another promise. So here we are in this environment. Satan cast down. God is using this environment with Satan in it to create the perfect ecosystem in which we can prove who we are. Now, who are we in relation to God? We either have God in us or we don't have God in us. And that comes down back into James, into the book of James. This is the ecosystem. Yeah. So I would argue that all of us are under trial all the time. We are on trial, maybe a better way to put it. But he says here, speaking of trials, consider it joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the working of your faith or testing of it produces endurance, and let it have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And if you lack wisdom, and that's not generic, this is very specific. Wisdom about what? This is the guy that's saying, God, why is this happening to me? If you really want, just sit and pray and talk and ask God. He'll express this to you. You'll generously be able to understand it. And I got to confess that the trial that I live through most of the time is not the trial of physical pain or struggle. I live through the trial of blessing. And this chapter to me says something about that I think is often overlooked. If you would, go down to verse 9. It says, let the brother of humble circumstance glory in his high position. There are some people, the trial that they live is in poverty, a want. A lot of people, most of the people in the world live under that trial. How do you deal with it? Can you stand up under the trial of struggle and suffering? But then the next verse says, let the rich man glory in his humiliation. That is a situation of trial. And to be honest with you, compared to the world, you and I struggle more as the rich man. We have so many blessings around us. Boy, sometimes it's hard to see God in all of that, but that's the environment.
No, I think, well stated here. I think a lot of times you can read a book, especially in the Bible, and because of these little headers, perspective of rich and poor. Okay, that has nothing to do with profiting from trials. You know what I'm saying? He's just going into a different topic. Well, that wasn't originally in the Bible. He's still on the same topic. He's just, like you said, you're bringing up a point. There is a struggle for the poor. There is a struggle for the rich. And you're 100% right. If we live in America, I mean, you've heard me say this before. When I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, the homeless community knew how to go to stores, KFC, and at the end, whatever chicken they didn't sell that day, they would just toss out. So there's a reason why a lot of homeless people are overweight, because even in America, the homeless have access to things that other countries, you're starving.
Boy, isn't that
and so if we live in America, we've been highly blessed. If you have a car, you're not the regular person in the world. You're very blessed. And then how does that affect our attitude towards things? Are we grateful? Are we thankful?
Yeah. Wow. I was reading this morning out of Exodus. So the children of Israel, they leave Egypt and they haven't been gone but 6 weeks. And they're already griping and complaining. They're complaining because there's not food like they want. There's not water like they want. Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Why did you bring us out here? And they were complaining like crazy. And I had written years ago at the top of my Bible a little note, and it really jumped off the page at me this morning as I was reading this. I wrote the note. Could you imagine if when God carried them out of Egypt, he had given all of them automobiles to ride in and fast food joints to stop at on the way and, Slurpees and 62-ounce drinks or whatever they are and hotel rooms to stay in at night and they'd complained. And you say, well, that's us, James. That's us. I mean, that's us on the road out of Egypt.
Well, I mean, here in America, you can find people who are overweight and miserable and depressed. They have a house, they have a car, and yet all they do is complain and miserable. And then you go to another country, maybe a third world country, somewhere either, south or across the ocean, and you find people who have no food and they have no shelter, and they have a good excuse to be depressed and down, not the ones who have too much.
So here's the environment. So we're on this earth, and your trial is either likely associated with prosperity. That is the situation of trial that we live in, or it's associated with poverty or suffering or maybe ill health, or maybe it's actual true persecution in some cases. There are people in the world who are Christians who literally are under the realm of persecution. Yeah. And again, this passage is really neat the way it lays it out. So in verse 9, he says, let the, definite articles there, let the brother of humble circumstance glory in his high position. Verse 10, let the rich man, definite articles there again, glory in his humiliation. And then in verse 12 it says, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. It gets generic there. He throws the door open. So you've got, in other words, he's laid out two specifics, and now he's going to say, but in generic, let's just put it this way, no matter what trial you're under, whether it's the trial of the poor man or the rich man, whatever circumstance you're in, blessed is the guy who does persevere under these trials. Once you have been approved, you'll receive the crown of life. That's the purpose of earth. Yep. And we need to get past the idea of thinking that the purpose of earth is to find God so that you can live here in a life of some kind of spiritual or physical wealth that is kind of in and of itself the reward. It is just not the reward. This flies in the face of the prosperity gospel.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And, when it says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Now, what's so fascinating about that to me is that's, first of all, that's the same word as endurance or patience. But I think the first initial response to people is what you see in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, is what happens when they sin. The first thing they do is what? They hide. Well, in order to go through a trial, you have to engage it. You have to stay present in it. And most people, their first initial thing is to run.
Sure.
But the one who endures through it, right, there's a reward. And I think ultimately life is not for the scared or the weak, but the bold and the brave.
Wasn't that true?
Reminds me of Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking to Joshua, and he says, do not be afraid, for the Lord thy God is with you wherever you go.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the march of a Christian. Yeah. We're supposed to be strong and courageous. Why? Because if you don't have a soldier mentality, when hard things come, you will run.
Yeah, I agree. When he speaks of the temptations now and shifts to this internal view, we're right back where you were talking about, because now we're facing something that is personally to me on the inside. I can be in all kinds of external circumstances, but now there are going to be things that test me from the inside out. So if you look at this again, if I'm right, and really earth is about this ecosystem that has been perfectly created through which we display who we are. Is God in us or is God not in us? It hits us from the outside and then it hits us from the inside. This is a total holistic purification that God's looking for. Everything, well, the Corinthian letter says, bring every thought into captivity unto Christ. Many passages in the Bible point out that we are engaged in this in such a holistic way that when it's all over with, we're going to have to make a choice as to whether everything in our life belongs to God. If then you've been risen together with Christ, keep seeking the things above. You've died. Your life is hidden together with Christ in God, Colossians 3:5. And this shift now happens, and he tells us where these temptations, these internal temptations come from. They are based on lust. That's verse 14. They're based on lust. It says, each is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust, not yours, but mine. Yeah. And then he says, when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. I actually accomplish it. But notice, it says when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. Lust in itself is the beginning of sin, which is in my heart. This really works well with Jesus' statement in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, not just to commit adultery is wrong, but rather to lust for a woman in her heart is wrong. That's because the seed is already there. Yeah. So the sin is already present, whether it just grown to full bloom or not. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, you think it out, you act on it spiritually before you act on it physically. Yeah. And that he's saying that once lust is conceived, meaning that you desire it in your heart, then it's going to manifest to sin.
And I think that we just did a whole series of podcasts where we were talking about like pornography and sexual sins. I think fits in this really well, because lust obviously is the seed of most sexual sin. Yeah, and that's why we have to guard our hearts against it. It is a rotten seed that is planted within us, and that's why the Scripture speaks about every other sin that a man commits is outside his body, but the man who commits sexual sin sins against his own body. So we have to be extremely careful there. Because it does impact every other aspect of our lives.
Well, in 1 Peter chapter 3, because this is talking about going through trials, but then James also talks about the struggle of lust and sin. And you could say that there's two ways to go through trials. There's two ways to struggle. And I'm just reminded of this text here. And this is 1 Peter 3, verse 17. It says, "For it is better if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right, rather for doing what is wrong." And to me, when you give into your lust and you sin, you're going to struggle. You're creating you're going to suffer and struggle through that. It may not be immediate, because there might be an immediate pleasure, but there's something that's going to come out of it because you chose to sin that you're going to have to deal with. And that's going to test you. And that's also going to, what is it? I think it's Hebrews 12. God disciplines those whom he loves.
Yes.
Like a father. And so you mess up, you're going to learn a lesson through it.
Let's go to Matthew 4 to kind of polish this off today. That's the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Yeah. The perfect example of what it means to deal with both trial and temptation. So the trial of Jesus starts when he goes into the wilderness. Yep. So for 40 days he fasts. That's the environment. So I always think of trials and more like in the environment, and then temptations as the internal. Yeah. So I can live in this environment that constitutes the stage upon which my struggle plays out, and that's the external influences. But then it's what's in my heart. So Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. He fasts, And at the end, and then it says the tempter came to him. Now you can couple this with Luke's account, and there's a little debate on whether Jesus is tempted the whole time during the 40 days or not. Well, my answer would be, I don't know why there's a debate. The fact of fasting itself, with the longing that it brings and the weakness that it brings, is the environment of trial. So Jesus was tempted or was tried by Satan the whole 40 days, but the specific temptations come at the end. Yeah. And they are the lust of the flesh, from 1 John 2:16, the lust of the eye, and the boastful pride of life. That's turn the stone into bread. That's the lust of the flesh. You're hungry. That's a legitimate need. Why don't you do this? Nope. Jesus says, I won't do that. I'm not taking anything from you. And then the second one, of course, is throw yourself down from the temple and let God rescue you. Nope. I'm not going through my pride to try to prove to you who I am. And then the third one, of course, is I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll bow down and worship me. Now, Jesus wanted all the kingdoms of the world, but not the way Satan offered them. And so the compromise was no good. And so Jesus says no. And so the lust of the eyes, the desire for that was passed. Now, if I look at all of those, and I gave that summation, and I know I'm talking more today than you are. Sorry. Right. I'll give you more mic time next time. Huh?
No, you're good.
But when I read this, what I see is that the temptations that Jesus deals with they are all striking at the heart of why he was sent to earth in the first place. They are very personal. They dealt with how he sustained himself, food. They dealt with how he saw himself in relation to God. There's humility there.
Yep.
And they dealt with what he knew his overall purpose was. That's what really makes temptation strike each of us in individual, personal ways, because James, you and I sustain ourselves roughly the same way through food. But when it gets past that, these other aspects of it, the lust of the eye and the boastful pride of life, those are themes that are tied to our personal exact missions. And that's why temptations look different for you than they do for me.
Well, in Hebrews, that's why it says he was tempted at every point.
Yes.
It was those areas that you're talking about that we can all relate to him. But going back to what you said, that he did want all the nations. Yeah. But if he had given in to Satan and gotten the nations that way, what's the difference between getting the nations that way and getting the nations the way that he wanted? And the key concept is suffering.
That's right. And one is temporal and the other is eternal.
That's right.
He could have had it maybe temporal.
Yeah. One that came fast and easy was going to be temporary.
Yep.
But the one that was eternal came with much trial and suffering.
Yes, it did.
And he was willing to go and pay it all so that he could reconcile the world back to you.
And so the imagery for us is Jesus himself, how many people in the New Testament said all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution?
That's right.
Paul says it. Jesus makes the same kind of statements. Take up your cross and follow me. You have to love me more than anybody else on earth. It is a very, very compelling argument that can be, it was not just an argument, it's a truth that can be established that if we're going to serve as Christians, if we're really going to follow Christ, it's going to cost us everything we have.
Yeah.
And that's not the way Christianity is marketed today.
And you better love God more than anything, because if you don't and you hold on to his teachings, you may find yourself with nothing but God. But if God is all you want, then you're content. And that goes back to the prosperity gospel. Jesus didn't guarantee you riches here on this earth. How many people do you see in the New Testament alone? In fact, I'm trying to think of any of them who are as examples in the New Testament who just walked around rich all the time and had abundance. They had to give up a great deal, and they had to share in order for them to live out their faith. And then, of course, you look at history. How many of the apostles were killed? All except for John, if I'm right.
That's what.
And then he died poor and alone, I think.
On an island. On an
island, right? Yeah. And so the thing is that why is because to them all they wanted was Christ. And in the end, that's what they got.
Yeah. And that's Paul's statements, boy, don't they come back from Colossians and Philippians specifically, that I've counted all things as garbage that I might know him and the power of his cross and, the power of his resurrection.
Yeah.
So he wanted to identify with that. So when I see all of this, here's where I kind of want to head with this as we bring this to a close. I think that the temptation we have, that's the internal part, is to look at all of our circumstances of life, and they're the trials, the stage upon which we act out our lives, and to see them in ways that are disconnected from the eternal purpose. And that's the danger. if we start to see all of it as interconnected with eternity, then all of a sudden things that make no sense to anyone else make sense to us.
Well, and that's why we're supposed to have urgency with our sin, because we don't want our sin to keep us from eternity with God. And so one, you have to recognize that you're a sinner, and then you have to recognize that sin has separated you from God. And in order to seek and live that relationship, your struggle is to separate from the temporal so that you can fully give yourself to the divine and eternal.
And in that, we find the new birth of Romans 6. So we disengage from the world and we pull ourselves into the eternal realm with Jesus as we clothe ourselves with his blood and his righteousness.
Amen.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that you'll spend a little bit of time today contemplating the trial that you're currently living in, the situation, the circumstance, and that you'll also focus on what you need to do to face up to the temptations, those internal desires that have to be turned over to him. It's all for our good. And thank God, soon, Satan will be completely, not just utterly defeated, but dealt with. And our future will be at the foot of the throne. I can't wait. We'll see you next time.